A family's heritage and traditions from the past are the special treasure that we leave to future generations. Without a remembrance of this past, the treasure is lost. Just as a family's past is their treasure, a church's past, St. Peter's past, is also a treasure that must be remembered and passed on to the younger and future members of the church. We would like to help you remember or relive some of the past of St. Peter's, so you too can help pass our treasure on to others. The Revolution and the war in Germany during the mid-1800s caused many people to leave their homeland. They came to America to make a new life for themselves and their families. War first broke out in northern Germany. It would be easy to assume that the people that settled in central Wisconsin came from that area. Marked in red are the cities of Hamburg, Berlin, and Stettin, Germany. Sound familiar? There were tales of virgin hardwood and pine forest for their new homes and a future in the lumber business. They found the climate and landscape reminded them of their homeland. Land could be purchased for the incredible sum of $1.25 per acre. A strong back was needed to clear the land for those first homes. One of the priorities of these German settlers was to gather together to worship God. However, religious leaders were difficult to find. One traveling missionary, Pastor Paul Streeter, served much of northern and central Wisconsin. Services were held in their family homes. Religious services were not held on a regular basis, many times not even on Sundays. Baptisms and weddings were scheduled around Pastor Streeter's arrival to the area. In 1861, land was set aside for a cemetery. The first person buried here was Mrs. Hannah Kaler. By 1862, Reverend Carl Huffman, some records show his name was John Jacob Huffman, was assisting Reverend Streeter by serving the surrounding area. They were both pioneer missionaries of the Missouri Synod. On June 1st, 1862, St. Peter Evangelical Lutheran Church was formed. Reverend Huffman was the first minister. Since he also served about 17 other congregations, services were not always held on Sunday mornings. For the first 25 years, the congregation gathered in a log school. The first Lafayette School was located on the corner where the Honeybee Cheese Factory is now located. Those fortunate enough took the horse and buggy to the church. Others walked. In winter, the horses pulled a sleigh. Abraham Lincoln was president at this time. The Civil War was raging. Did the South have the right to secede from the Union and split the country? When St. Peter's was established, it was actually in the township of Berlin. Not because it moved, but because Hamburg was not yet formed. Hamburg Township was formed in 1876. In March of 1867, Pastor Huffman accepts a call to Portage County. Reverend William Hutliff became the next minister. It has been said that he laid the groundwork for the future development of the church. He spent 5 years traveling on foot and horseback to the many missions he served in this wide area. In 1872, Pastor Huffman returned to St. Peter's and the other local churches. He remained here for 10 more years. In 1881, the Wisconsin Valley Railroad Company donated 20 acres of land to St. Peter's. The first parsonage, a log cabin, was built on this land. It was located 1 mile west of the church. Over the years, this land has been sold to Frank Ashburner for $2,000. He agreed that the schoolhouse, which was on this property, was to be reserved for use by the church and that the annual picnics could be held in those woods. Reverend P. Litke started his 2 years of service in 1882. St. Peter offered him a salary of $150 per year, plus 23 bushels of wheat, 46 bushels of oats, and 3 acres of clover to be worked by the congregation. He would preach for 3 Sundays, have the 4th Sunday free, and would teach 60 days of school. Sounds like quite a deal. How could anyone refuse? The church records show that he received a bonus of hay, straw, and a sack of potatoes. The congregation was obviously pleased with Pastor Liedtke's work. The next minister to lead our fold was Reverend Julius Emke. He served from 1885 to 1894, a total of 9 years. After his death, Pastor Emke was buried in St. Peter's Cemetery. In 1887, John Zastrow Sr. donated a 1/4 acre for a church to be built next to the cemetery. The cornerstone from the foundation of this church is located in the old kitchen basement. If we went to one of the services in this first church, they would have been a little different than today's service. Since these settlers were from Germany, and this was the language spoken by most of the congregation, services were done in German. It was traditional for the men to sit separately from the women. The men sat on the right-hand side of the church, women on the left. Communion was distributed to the men first. This segregation lasted until the 1940s. A 3-sided horse barn was erected on the Urbanhof farm across the road from the church. This provided some protection for the animals and the buggies during church services. The Huffs also provided parking for the first automobiles until a parking lot was made next to the church. The church was heated, as all of the homes were, with a large wood stove. You had to get to church early for a good seat, too. Close to the heater, the pews were hot. Too far away, it was quite cool. In the late 1800s, as more people moved into the area, the congregations wanted regular Sunday services. This meant the missionary fields were established as separate churches. For many years, St. Peter and its sister church Trinity from the town of Berlin were joined by 2 more churches from the town of Maine. Our research shows these 2 churches were Emmanuel and St. John's Lutheran Church.
In 1887, the first phonograph is patented by Thomas Edison. In 1888, George Eastman's first box camera was sold. It was called a Kodak. It is possible that some of these original pictures we have in the program were taken with those early Kodaks. This is a baptismal certificate dated 1888. It is for Marta Maria Albertine Kluxine. Pastors were given stipends for special services. A church baptism was $1, a home baptism $1.50, confirmation $3, funeral services $1, marriage ceremonies $3. Alfred and Norma Voigt were married during this decade. Notice the dark color of the wedding dresses. Dresses of this era were practical ones which could have been worn for other occasions as well. This is the wedding picture of Albert and Anna Huff. Summertime is picnic time, and St. Peter's was no exception. The first Sunday of June, the congregation was off to Ashbrenner's Woods for its annual Mission Sunday picnic. Later in the summer, the Ladies' Aid Society had their annual picnic and bazaar. The women of the church made a dinner that was served after church services. The Zion's Town of Maine church band would play in the afternoon, while the congregation feasted on the goodies from the ice cream, candy, and fruit stands. The Ladies' Aid Bazaar featured handiwork that was auctioned off to raise money for the church. Reverend A. Alexander became the spiritual leader of our church in 1894. He was replaced by Reverend F. Neubauer 3 years later. Reverend Neubauer also served as a vacancy pastor to the Salem Church in Hamburg. This is why Salem members appear in our records. In 1897, the year Reverend Neubauer came to St. Peter's, William McKinley became the 25th President of the United States. The next year, in 1898, the cry, "Remember the Maine," was heard. The U.S. battleship Maine was sunk in a Cuban harbor. This started the Spanish-American War. The U.S. was fighting for the independence of Cuba and the Philippines. You may recognize this man as Teddy Roosevelt. He became known as one of the Rough Riders. In 1901, he would become President of the U.S. Reverend H. Redder served our church in 1900. In 1901, Reverend August Kepp accepted our call. He moved to Hamburg with his wife Bertha. He and his wife settled here for the next 30 years to raise their family of 6 children and guide our congregation in the spiritual needs. In addition to serving our church, Reverend Kepp also was pastor for our sister churches, Trinity, Emmanuel, and St. John's. Henry Ford patented the Model A in 1902, and the Ford Motor Company was formed. However, in Hamburg, horsepower still came from horses. Here are some horsemobiles in front of Bialke's store in Little Chicago. Bialke's later became known as Reamer's, and in the late 1990s was known as Murley's Bar. The next year, Wilbur and Orville Wright flew the Kitty Hawk, the first airplane.
Most wedding dresses at the turn of the century were still very practical. Some of the gowns were actually a skirt and blouse. This is Amo and Martha Hilke's 1901 wedding picture. Notice the bridal veil. You will see it again on some of the other wedding pictures. It is possible that the veil was passed from bride to bride, or even borrowed from the photographer for her to wear. 3 years later, in 1904, William and Bertha Vogt were married. Bertha's veil is the same as Martha's. This is a group portrait of Mr. and Mrs. John Zastrow Jr.'s wedding. The wedding invitations from this era were printed in German. This is an invitation to Henrietta Vogt and Albert Yedis's wedding. They were married on Saturday, October 23, 1909 at 2:00 p.m. at St. Peter's Evangelical Lutheran Church. Ernest Pickroom and Alvina Klexim were also married in this era. This is a wedding certificate from this period. It is about the size of a newspaper page. They were often framed and hung on the wall. Remembrance cards were given at funerals. This card, printed in German, is for an infant, William Wendt. The words above the angel say, Angel of Peace. It ends with a verse that is probably a poem rather than a Bible passage. No, this is not the fashion in Hamburg for gathering firewood in the middle of January. This is Robert Peary, who discovered the North Pole in 1901.
It is 1913 and Woodrow Wilson is elected to be the 28th President of the United States. The next year, the Great War, World War I, between the Central Powers and the Allies begins. This is Harry Emmerich, a doughboy from this era. In 1919, Prohibition began. Homemade beer continues to be a popular item in this era. The women's suffrage movement in the 1920s helped Congress to push through the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. Interestingly enough, it is 1 year after women get the right to vote that the Ladies' Aid Society was formed at St. Peter's. This organization was formed to give women more opportunities to become involved in the church and community activities. Our church and the area continued to grow. Like the marriage certificate we saw before, baptismal certificates were a beautiful keepsake. This is the baptismal certificate of Clarence Ernst Edward Klexim. In 1920, 2 acres of land was purchased from Paul Borkert for $450. This is the wedding picture of Paul and Elsa Borkert. We needed this land for a new parsonage. Since our congregations were growing, Trinity and St. Peter's formed their own parish separate from St. John and Emmanuel of Maine Township. This picture was taken in the 1960s. Unfortunately, we were not able to find an earlier picture of the parsonage.
This is the wedding picture of Oscar and Nora Borkert. They were married in 1920. Edwin and Erna Huff were also married in 1920. Alfred and Norma Vogt wedding was in 1919. Norma was 16 years old when she got married. Come to the wedding of Alma Yidis and August Thurs. This 1923 wedding invitation is written in German, still a popular language in this community. This is the wedding picture of Elmer and Elsie Bonnick. They were married in 1920. In this era, it was popular to frame the bridal veil and parts of the wedding bouquet with the couple's wedding picture. In 1922, you could buy this Chevrolet for $680. Horses were still popular in this area in 1922. This picture was taken in front of Hilke's Hall. Henry Folk got some horsepower out of his team to get the field's work done. Calvin Coolidge was elected as the 30th president in 1923. 1929 was a dismal year in the country. No one from this period of time will forget the crash of the stock market and the run on the banks. Many people lost their life savings overnight, thus became the Depression. 1929 did provide some good times and periods of celebration in our church. On November 22nd, the Reverend and Mrs. Kepp celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary at Hilke's Hall. The German hymnal was used for church services. It was published by the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Ohio. The church did not have hymnals in the pews as we do today. They were given as confirmation gifts. This is the hymnal of Gloria Huff Wiederhave, received in 1938. The congregation mourned the death of Reverend Kepp. Reverend Kepp died in 1931. He served our congregation and Trinity for 30 years. Ernest Beyer was installed as a new minister on October 11, 1931. 10 years after the new parsonage was built, we were ready to start building again. In 1932, we purchased 1/4 acre of land from John Zastro to build a sacristy for the church. Church records for this year show that $129 was spent on building materials. The land was purchased for $50. The sacristy added some needed room to the church. No longer would the minister have to change into his robes behind the altar. We've seen the beautiful baptismal and wedding certificates of this era. This certificate is to commemorate Clarence Hilke's confirmation in 1933. Who doesn't remember Vacation Bible School? This June tradition was started in 1932. We don't know exactly when the Sunday School program began. However, we do have a copy of a lesson from 1935, and in English too. June of 1931 is when Greta and Walter Pruss's wedding was held. Edna and Leonard Wendt were married in October of 1930. Helen and Harry Konkelfitz's wedding was in June of 1932. June of 1928 is the wedding date of Elsie and William Hunke. The chandeliers hanging in our church today were used even before Hamburg had electricity. There were kerosene lamps on the chandeliers instead of the globes and light bulbs we have today. Someone had to climb a ladder to light each of the 6 lanterns with the mat. Since kerosene leaves a black film, the lamps had to be cleaned on a regular basis. Electricity came to the church in 1928. It was furnished to us by Hilke's store. The store used the Delco system. This was a generator that recharged batteries for electricity. A wire was run from Hilke's store to the church.
In 1930, the original American Lutheran Church was formed. This was brought about by the merger of the Ohio, Iowa, and Buffalo Senates. In 1932, the minimum wage is 25 cents per hour. In 1987, the rate was $3.35. In the late 1990s, it was $5.25. Franklin Roosevelt took over the office of presidency in 1933. He would hold that office for the next 12 years. What kind of cars did the congregation drive to church? Take a look at some of these beauties. Do any of them look familiar? In 1937, St. Petr's celebrated two anniversaries, the 75th anniversary of the start of the congregation and the 50th anniversary of the building of the church. A special celebration was held to commemorate the event, and of course, both the service and the remembrance booklet were printed in German. This is how our church looked in 1937. The church was actually located in the driveway that is between the present location of the church and the cemetery. 1 year later, in 1938, Trinity celebrated the 50th anniversary of the building of their church.
The Ladies' Aid Society continues to meet regularly. Special events made each of their meetings memorable. How many remember when Emma Kickbush was crowned May Queen in 1939? It was for the 20th anniversary in 1941 that this photograph of the members of the Ladies' Aid were taken. They are standing in front of the German school. The generous contributions of the Ladies' Aid Society through the years have helped to enhance the beauty and worship of this congregation. In the 1980s, their work continues. They are now responsible for, among other things, decorating the church for special church holidays, making banners, decorations for the Christmas trees, purchasing flowers for Easter and Christmas, fruit baskets for the elderly and homebound, and preparing and serving wedding and funeral meals. It is from the contributions of the Ladies' Aid Society that this presentation was funded. We appreciate their interest in preserving the history of our church. English services were first introduced to the congregation in 1941. It was decided that one Sunday service a month would be said in English. It is at this point that the use of German began to decrease. We started to use the American Lutheran hymnal during this time. Come one, come all to the wedding and reception of Art and Belinda Christian on September 19, 1939. Note that their reception will be held at the Little Chicago Pavilion, better known to youngsters as Reamer's, and in the late 1990s as Merle's Bar. Here we see Art and Belinda on their wedding day. Note that the gowns now have long flowing trains. Lawrence and Hilda Rader were married on October 18, 1941. Again, we see that the style of the day shows a long train. Many weddings of this era were those held just before the men went to serve in the army or while they were home on leave. Because of that, many brides chose a simple evening dress. This is Gloria and Harold Wiederhig. They were married in December of 1941.
In the 1940s, television began to increase in popularity. It wouldn't be until the 1950s that Wausau would get its first television station, Channel 7, a CBS station. World War II began in 1939 when Hitler invaded Poland. The United States entered the war when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. Germany surrendered in 1945, ending the war in Europe. The first atomic bombs were used when the U.S. bombed Japan. Japan surrendered shortly thereafter. In 1945, Harry Truman became the 33rd President of the United States. Who was driving these cars to church in the 1940s? Sometime between the mid-1930s and 40s, the peak of the steeple was removed from the church. We are not sure of the reason it was done. It may have been that the main timbers had rotted, or it may have been to modernize the appearance of the church. Reverend Arthur Wachholz accepted our call and was installed as pastor in June of 1944. He served until 1947. The parish celebrated its 85th anniversary of its founding on Reformation Sunday, October 27, 1946. In 1946, the German school was moved from the Ashbrenner property so that it would be next to the church. This is a good view of the church and the school at that time. In 1947, Reverend Carl Schmidt was called to become pastor of both St. Petri and Trinity.
Wedding dresses with the long trains remained popular throughout the 1940s, as these pictures will show. This is Arthur and Marion Kickbush's wedding of 1946. Norman and Dolores Hahn were married in June of 1946. Melvin and Rosalie Hunke were married in 1948. John and Leila Artis's wedding was in September of 1949. Major remodeling occurred in 1949. It all started when the congregation decided to put a basement under the church and install a furnace. Adding the basement allowed them to move the church a little so that a driveway could be made around the church. The steeple was removed and replaced by 2 towers. Then the remodeling of the interior was started. The tin panels on the wall were replaced with the panels we have today. The original altar was kept, however, a new pulpit and lectern were designed to match the altar. A stained glass window was installed behind the altar. This is a new cornerstone in the foundation to signify the years of service of the church. The project cost the congregation $25,000. It was at this time that the German school and the woodshed were sold. Unfortunately, we were not able to locate any pictures of this major remodeling project. The pictures shown are from the 1960s through the present. Gerald and Irene Borkert were married in 1950. In 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea. This was the beginning of the Korean conflict. Troops were first sent to Korea in 1950. The armistice was signed in 1953. It was the same year, 1953, that Dwight D. Eisenhower became president. Sunday school continues to provide a religious education for the children of our congregation. This is a lesson from 1954. Jean and Jenny Vogt were married in May of 1954.
St. Petri Evangelical Lutheran Church was officially changed to St. Peter Evangelical Lutheran Church in 1953. By 1957, German church services are being held only once a month. John Zastros sold us some more land around this time to add to our parking area. Trinity Evangelical Lutheran Church, our sister congregation, merged with St. Peter in 1956. All of the members who wished to transfer were received at St. Peter's. The Trinity Church was torn down in 1959. Reverend Herman Lashinsky became our pastor in 1957, after Reverend Schmidt retired. In 1959, St. Peter's had their first organ transplant. A new Baldwin organ was dedicated on January 18, 1959. The new organ replaced an old pipe organ. The pipe organ was originally in the loft of the balcony. That new parking lot that was added was probably to accommodate cars like these from the mid-1950s. It is hard to believe that it's been 40 years since the space age began. The space age started when the Russians launched the first Sputnik satellite. That was in 1957. In 1959, Alaska and Hawaii became the 49th and 50th states of the Union. In 1961, John F. Kennedy became the 35th president. 2 years later, he would be assassinated. It was in 1960 that the Ladies' Aid Society and the Women's Mission Circle was discontinued, and the Women of the Church organization was begun. In 1961 was the year when German services were discontinued at St. Peter's. English had become the main language of the area. By 1962, the need for more room was resolved by constructing an addition to the church. Modern plumbing and bathroom facilities were installed with this remodeling. The cornerstone of the new fellowship hall was laid by Reverend Lashinsky on June 17, 1962. On September 9th of 1962, we celebrated our 100th anniversary of the congregation being formed. Guest speakers for that occasion were our former pastor, the Reverend Carl Schmidt, and the Reverend Eugene Lashinsky, the son of Pastor Lashinsky. In 1963, a new hymnal was introduced to the congregation. It was the Service Book and Hymnal. That same year, Reverend David Wenger became pastor of St. Peter. Pastor Wenger and his wife Joan have 2 children. He is retired and living in Yorba Linda, California.
Weddings of the 1960s started to show a similar style of dress as compared to the 1940s and 50s. Herbert and Marge Fromm's wedding picture from 1960s is an example of this. Laverne and Marilyn Grunewald were married in 1965. It was in 1963 that Lyndon Johnson became a president. A year later, North Vietnam boats attacked U.S. destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin. Troops began to be sent in ever-increasing numbers. Our efforts in Vietnam continued for the next 11 years.
1968 was the year that Reverend Richard Bremer was installed as pastor. He and his wife, Charlsie, have 3 children. Pastor Bremer is currently retired and living in Burnett, Texas. What cars did people drive to church to hear Pastor Bremer preach?
White cars from the late 1960s. The space age that began in the 1950s reached its peak when Neil Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon on July 20, 1969. 1969 was also the year that Richard Nixon became the 37th president. The phrase, "I am not a crook," would become forever famous. Weddings of the early 70s continued to show the simple lines seen in the dresses of the 1960s. This is Gerald and Geraldine Folk's wedding from October of 1969. October of 1970 was the date for John and Jean Reed's wedding. The old church pews served their congregation long and hard, but their age began to take a toll on them. Near Christmas of 1970, they were replaced with these more modern pews. People could now sit in comfort for the 1972 wedding of Richard and Dawn Garkey. Notice how bridal dresses are starting to become more elaborate again. This is Anthony and Sandy Barnashevsky wedding. Their wedding was in 1973.
Prior to 1973, mobile phones were only installed in cars and other vehicles. On April 3rd of 1973, Motorola made the first mobile phone call from a portable phone. This phone weighed 2.5 pounds and offered a talk time of 30 minutes, and it took 10 hours to recharge. Vice President Gerald Ford assumed the presidency when President Nixon resigned on August 9, 1974. President Ford was 93 years old when he died in 2006.
Christmas is a special time for Christians all over the world. In the 1970s, Christmas ornaments were made by the women of the church to make the Christmas tree more symbolic of our Christian heritage. Candlelight services were held on Christmas Eve. This replaced the old tradition of the children's Christmas Eve program. Their program would be held 1 or 2 weeks before Christmas. The children's Christmas program were always a time of joy and pride. Many years ago, pieces or Bible verses would be said in German. German songs would be sung by the children. Later on, English would replace the German, but many of the same pieces would be recited and the same song sung. Many times, the children's program would include the Nativity. The costumes the children were wearing were becoming a tradition of St. Peter's. Originally made in the 1960s, they are still used today. A tradition is giving bags of candy and fruit to the children. For the children, the Christmas program is fun. But it's more fun to find out after the program what goodies are in the bag. The tradition of the Sunday summer picnic continued in the 1970s. They were held in the picnic woods 1 mile west of the church. There was a variety of activities that went on during the modern picnics. The women of the church would be selling meals by the summer kitchen. The Brotherhood would set up a dunk tank and a fish pond of toys for the children. The Luther League would set up other games. Sometimes Concertina Carl Foyt, would provide some musical entertainment. However, in the 1980s, the picnic woods remains quiet, as it is no longer used. In 1975, Reverend Lawrence Sturgis became pastor of our church. Pastor Sturgis and his wife Anita currently live in Bruce, Wisconsin. They have 2 children. A new hymnal began to be used at this time, the Lutheran Book of Worship.
Jimmy Carter became the 39th president in 1977. After leaving office, Carter and his wife Rosalind founded the Carter Center in 1982, a non-governmental, not-for-profit organization that works to advance human rights. The home computer revolution started in 1977 with the first successfully mass-produced personal computers. These included the Apple II, Commodore PET, and the TRS-80 from Radio Shack. In 1979, the Reverend Earl Vorpagel accepted our call and was installed as pastor. Pastor Vorpagel and his wife Patty have 3 children and live in Green Bay. He is pastor of Calvary Lutheran Church. Patty's parents are members of our church, Vernon and May Mathweek. Rhonda Vogt and John Altvillisch were married on June 10, 1978.
Wedding dresses from the early 1980s continued to show the delicate detailing that was seen in the 1970s. Here's the wedding of Lloyd and Darla Parks. Edward and Irene Miller's wedding was also held in 1980.
Former actor and California Governor Ronald Reagan was elected the 40th president in 1981. He served for 8 years. President Reagan passed away in 2004 at the age of 93. The first space shuttle launch was on April 12, 1981. The last launch was 30 years later on July 21, 2011. On July 31, 1982, Kay Steininger and Chris Lynn were married.
In September of 1982, Glenn and Joanne Crum were married. It was also in 1982 that some remodeling occurred at the parsonage. The old shed and garage were torn down. A new garage was built next to the house.
1983 is when the Reverend Rod Rashesky was installed. He served our congregation for 2 years. He and his wife, Sue, live in Oconomowoc, Wisconsin. He is pastor of Our Savior Lutheran Church. The Reverend Douglas Helling was installed on June 3, 1984. He and his wife, Nancy, have 2 children, Clarissa and Jonathan. Pastor Helling served our church for 20 years. He is currently retired and living in Weston, Wisconsin.
In 1984, work was already well underway for the groundwork of the new Lutheran Church.
John Stubbe and Valerie Voigt were married on August 18, 1984 at St. Peter's. Steve Shimmick and Karen Thurs were married on April 19, 1985.
One of the weddings that were celebrated in 1986 was that of Scott and Carol Thurs. Notice that the dress has a long train like those of the 1950s.
St. Peter's youth group, called the Luther League, emphasized community concern by working on a paper recycling drive in the 1970s. They also participated in Christian fellowship through various social activities. Each year, the Luther League invited the congregation to join them in Christmas caroling. They sang at the homes of the older people of the congregation and the bedridden. Fruit baskets were given to the older members of the congregation. Dartball has been the sport That is the winter equivalent of softball team the church had in the summertime. This is St. Peter's 1985 dartball team.
The American Lutheran Church women of St. Peter's continue to be involved in church activities. A major project throughout the year is preparing for the November collection of clothes, quilts, and soap for the Lutheran World Relief. Here's Lucinda Schessel sewing on one of the quilts. Dora Schessel is packing up the 200 pounds of homemade soap that was made. Harold Schessel helps pack up the collected clothes. The box of clothes, soap, and quilts are transferred to a semi-trailer to be distributed worldwide. In the 1970s, the ALCW organized the annual Advent dinner and party. The party was enjoyed by all. And profits from this party are used to help purchase Christmas gifts, which were given to local nursing home residents. St. Peter's was the host church in January of 1987 of the General Board meeting of the WASA Conference of the ALCW.
On June 7, 1987, St. Peter celebrated their 125th anniversary. Pastor Helling presided and Pastor Bremer preached at the worship services. A lunch was served and followed by an afternoon service and a slide presentation entitled A Past to Remember. 1987 was also the 100th anniversary of the building that served St. Peter's members for almost its whole history. Here are the 5 top-selling cars in 1987. Average cost for the Escort and Cavalier was $7,000, and for the Taurus, Accord, and Celebrity, $12,000. Did you drive one of these? On January 1st of 1988, St. Peter's, along with the other American Lutheran Church congregations, merged with 2 other Lutheran synods to become the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the ELCA. In 1989, George Herbert Walker Bush started his service as the 41st President of the U.S. He had previously served as the Vice President under Ronald Reagan and, as of the year 2012, at the age of 88, is currently the oldest surviving president. Our roots are in Germany, so it was with interest that we watched the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 pave the way for German reunification a year later. The fall of the wall was also symbolic of the collapse of the Russian Communist Republic in Eastern Europe. A new tradition started at St. Peter in 1990, the annual Chili Supper. It has been held every March since then. This major fellowship event draws in friends and family from all over central Wisconsin. Through the years, the proceeds of the Chili Supper and raffle have supported the major repair, maintenance, and remodeling projects that are necessary to keep a church in good repair. 2012 was the 22nd time the event was held. In 1991, the Persian Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm, starts after Iraq invades Kuwait. On May 2, 1992, Cindy Slagowski and Chris Zuliger were married at St. Peter. In 1993, Bill Clinton became the 42nd President of the United States and served for the next 8 years. It was in the early 1990s that the use of the World Wide Web slowly began to spread. It was in 1995 that Amazon.com first went online. In 1994, Patty Nichol and Randy Kloth were married on August 4th. A year later, in 1995, a new roof and siding were installed on the church. This helped to reduce the long-term maintenance on the exterior of the 108-year-old building. Diane Voigt and Gary Johnson were united in matrimony on August 28, 1999. The bringing in of a new century was celebrated worldwide. The feared Y2K computer software failure turned out to be a false alarm. In 2001, George Walker Bush became the 43rd President of the United States and served for the next 8 years. He is also the eldest son of the 41st President. On September 11, 2001, terrorists attacked the U.S., including the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. 2,976 Americans were killed, and over 6,000 wounded by the attacks. Almost a year later, on August 24, 2002, Haley Voigt and Greg Ellenbecker were married at St. Peter. For almost 80 years, the early summer tradition of Vacation Bible School has happened at St. Peter. It is a time when fun, fellowship, and faith are shared and enjoyed both by the children and the adults that are participating. The 2003 invasion of Iraq was the start of the conflict known as the Iraq War. Post-invasion Iraq was marked by a long and violent conflict between U.S.-led forces and Iraqi insurgents. It would be 8 years later in 2011 before American combat operations in Iraq would end. It was in 2005 that diaconal minister Sharon Gall began serving our church. She would serve until 2007. Improvements continued on the church building. In 2005, the ceiling and walls of the tower and balcony stairs area were remodeled and refinished, resulting in a much more pleasing appearance to the areas. It was also in 2005 that Hurricane Katrina devastated New Orleans and the South. It was one of the 5 deadliest hurricanes in the history of the U.S., with almost 1,900 confirmed dead, 700 missing, and $80 billion in losses. October 14, 2006 was the wedding date of Melissa Thurs and Ryan Voigt. The Reverend Sarah Naring became interim pastor at St. Peter in 2007. She served the congregation until 2009. Another organ transplant occurred at St. Peter in 2007. The new organ, purchased by the members through Organ Key fundraising, enhances the Sunday services at the church. March 17, 2007 was the wedding of Jill Larson and Brad Mathwick. Rebecca Danel and Greg Klumpian were married on May 3, 2008. It was also in 2008 that the church parsonage was sold. It was originally built in the 1920s. Nationwide, the use of parsonages is declining. The trend is toward clergy owning their own homes, with one study indicating that only 32% of pastors live in a parsonage. In October of 2008, a new tradition was started at St. Peter, the Sunday Chicken Dinner. The day starts out with a polka service and is followed by a meal of delicious barbecued grilled chicken with all the fixins. Years of questionable mortgage and bank investment transactions caused the real estate market to crash in 2008. This led to the bankruptcy of major U.S. banks and other large firms. Unemployment reached 10% throughout the U.S. In 2009, Barack Obama became the 44th and current President of the United States. He is the first African American to hold the office. The Reverend Philip Bogan was installed as pastor of the congregation in 2009. Pastor Bogan is also the pastor of Trinity Lutheran Church in the town of Stettin. The new ELCA hymnal, Evangelical Lutheran Worship, was introduced to the congregation in 2009. A new annual event is the Ice Cream Social, a special time for fellowship and to enjoy one of the foods that makes Wisconsin famous, ice cream. Here Ryan and Hudson Voigt are enjoying the event. In winter it's dartball, in summer it's softball. Through the years, many of St. Peter's members have played on the church's softball team that was part of the local church leagues. This Sunday afternoon sport has been enjoyed for over a half a century. What were the top-selling vehicles in 2010? Trucks outsold cars for the 2 top spots. The average cost of a new car in 2010 was $28,400. In 2010, many interior renovations occurred in the church. These included the installation of new carpeting and flooring in the sanctuary, updates to the chancel area including the removal of the communion rail and the restoring of the altar statue of Christ. Also, painting and installation of new lighting was completed in the basement. In November of 2010, a craft and bake sale was held for the first time. It went so well that the event is being held in spring and fall. The proceeds help support the church's building fund. Changes to the church continued in 2011. Access to the church by the disabled and elderly had been a challenge in the past, but a new addition to the fellowship hall changed that. The new addition provided a covered handicap accessible entrance, a new restroom, a church office, and a janitor's room. In 2012, the wedding of Heidi Weinkoff and Jeremiah Danel was held at St. Peter on April 21st. With the fellowship hall expansion, more parking space was needed. This was added in 2012. On June 24, 2012, St. Peter celebrated the 150th anniversary of the founding of the congregation. It was also the 125th anniversary of the church building. What will the next 25 years hold for the congregation of St. Peter Evangelical Lutheran Church? The 23rd annual Chili Supper will be held on March 12, 2013. In 2013, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America will celebrate the 25th anniversary of its founding. This energized church is composed of over 4 million members and 10,000 congregations across the U.S. and Caribbean. The ELCA also shares full communion with 6 fellow Protestant partners. Today, the ELCA reflects the rich and diverse heritage of the people it serves. Our memories of the past are the treasures we leave for the friends, families, and members of St. Peter Evangelical Lutheran Church. What we learn from these treasures is what the future is built on. Through the help of Jesus Christ, our future treasures will be as rich and full as our past.